What does it take to make workshops work? And how can we facilitate collaboration that sticks and leads to results? My name is Miriam Hatness, and with the Workshops Work podcast, I'm on the mission to find the magic ingredients that make workshops work. Today with me on the show is Meg Bolger, and we just geek out on facilitation. It's a long-form show, and I'm sure you'll find a ton of golden nuggets. So be attentive. And by the way, if you don't have pen and paper at hand to take your own notes, scroll down to the show notes and download my free one-page summary. Now, get ready to enjoy. Hello, Meg.
Hello.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I'm super excited to geek out on facilitation with you.
Yes, I am excited about anybody who wants to do that. And I'm excited because you've spent a lot of time geeking out about facilitation with facilitation geeks. So maybe, I don't know if you would consider yourself an Uber geek, but it feels up there.
You were definitely the first who introduced yourself as a facilitation geek. So I'd be curious, when did you start calling yourself a facilitator? When did you move from being a facilitator to a facilitation geek? And what does it actually mean?
So I started doing facilitation and what I thought of as facilitation in college. I was doing gender and sexuality workshops. And then I was also part of a group of people who were facilitating incoming students to take them out on wilderness trips as part of their kind of orientation program, which I think more smaller colleges in the US, at least in the Northeast, that's actually quite popular to have basically some sort of trip experience at the beginning of your college experience. And so I also was part of leading students on those trips. And we used the word facilitator, or we talked about facilitation in that context. And then also in my social justice, gender and sexuality trainings, I very much saw myself as a facilitator rather than a teacher or a trainer. I don't know why, probably because of that experiential piece. And I think that, when did I become a facilitation geek? I would say in college, I started teaching other people how to do it. So before I graduated, I was teaching people how to lead gender and sexuality trainings because I went to a very small college, there were no professional staff doing this. And so I was I don't want this program to die when I leave. I'll run a trainer. I've done 20 of these things or 30 of these things. I can teach other people how to do it. And so I don't know. I had the analysis of what made that work and what made good sessions and bad sessions. And I knew it wasn't the content, that the content could be the same every time. But if you say, does anyone have any questions? You'll get crickets. But if you say, everyone write down a question on an index card and pass it in, you'll get 10 questions. And so even in that was junior year of high school, I learned that, or college, I learned that lesson. And that to me was so clearly this isn't the content, this is actually the process, and how you do it really, really matters. And then I went to a conference called the Association of Experiential Educators, which I still go to. It's a lot of outdoor wilderness adventure educators, some wilderness therapists, but a lot of people who just really believe that you can have an experience and you can learn something from that experience and from debriefing or understanding that experience. And those people are all facilitation geeks. They're some of them are group game geeks. They're the people who have 50 different games that they can do with one little ball or whatever. And that was also really influential in just seeing how people did different things, and that I wasn't the only one writing down how people were doing things, not just the content that you were there to learn. I was that guy does intros good. That person is really good at bringing people back together when they go off track and taking notes on that stuff. And to me, if you're a person that takes notes, not on the content of the workshop, but on the process, you're probably a facilitation geek.
The meta level of the experience.
Yeah.
And I'm intrigued about the example that you gave, which is so obvious. Ask a group, does anyone has a question? And everyone shows up. What made you realize that? Did you read books about facilitation to get the training, or was it learning by doing, or just observing what's happening?
it was all trial by fire. It was all getting it wrong and caring in a way that made me really want to get it right. But, for me, about the topic that I was doing, I was really passionate about people understanding gender and sexuality. And I knew that I felt very much like if I can do this well, it can have a real and lasting impact. And there was a particular workshop for that one where I was like, man, this workshop is like cruising. We're doing so well. Everyone's talking. Everyone's excited. People are surprised that they're learning things. They thought they were going to be, they thought they were going to know everything and they didn't. And then I remember being like, I always did anonymous questions with index cards, in person. And I was like, this group doesn't need that, I bet we can just do this out loud. And so I was like, all right, so we usually do anonymous questions, but I think we're comfortable with each other, what questions do you all have? And just no one had any questions. And I was like, I knew in that moment, if workshops that were going less well than that asked me questions, it was the form, it was the invitation and the process of that invitation that really mattered, not do they have questions or not? Because I knew these people were invested in all of those things. So yeah, I had a mentor in college that was the person who ran the orientation or the outdoor orientation program, outdoor leadership. And that person taught us facilitation and leadership. That was my formal exposure, but that wasn't in-person classrooms. That wasn't a person who specialized in training. Everything else was trial by fire, learning as I do, and then working with other facilitators and picking things up from them or paying attention to that meta level process, and then just doing it a lot. And I now create a lot of resources so that people don't have to learn that way, because I think that there was a lot of learning I could have expedited, that somebody who's never facilitated before could be like, got it. Don't ask people questions, don't ask open-ended questions, just give them an index. That's great. I can do that, and you don't have to miss the 10 opportunities it took me to learn that.
It's so funny how sometimes we step into this trap of, oh, now I understand the group dynamics. And as you said, we can do it like this, but it's basically, for me, it's also the awareness that the human brain works in a certain way, and there's no hack around that. So it is so vulnerable to just raise your hand and to ask a question in a large group and to go first. And I think especially online. So if you even take away this moment of turning to your neighbor and just making sure that the question you're asking is not super stupid. What I like to do is if the group is not too big, to go around and say, everyone ask one question. And if you cannot think of a question, then ask about the weather for tomorrow. But everyone can think of one question to take the friction out and then to answer all the questions at once. Because I also realized that if we go into this question and answer ping pong and answer them right away, suddenly the time is up and we didn't get the chance to listen to all of them.
Yep. I love that. And it's very similar. One of my friends who does a lot more speaking, he's a brilliant facilitator, but he's also a good speaker. When he's doing a Q&A section, or I think even at the end of his workshop, sometimes he'll have people do that kind of question dump, and he'll frame it as I just want you to dump your questions for the next 2 minutes. And then I'm going to filter them and answer the ones I can, or theme them, and answer them in order. And I just thought it was really clever of him, because it allows him to answer the questions that he wants to, answer them in groups, segment out all of it. It gives him so much more agency, rather than who has a question? Great, will you do your question? And it could be a question you don't want to answer, and you're I can't be bad question, next question. You can't do that unless you get them all at once, whether that's out loud or in the chat.
Yeah. And also it might inspire the group to come up with other questions that are somehow related, and that they might not have thought of, but suddenly they feel encouraged to ask that.
Totally. Yeah.
For me, that's one of the high art of facilitation skills, this thinking on your feet, to be able to cluster and to screen all the questions and to then see a general theme and bring them together.
Yeah. Sometimes, to give myself more. I did this recently in a workshop where I had people ask the questions they were coming in with, and then I gave them small group time, and then I went and looked at all the questions and I answered the questions later. And you can't always do that, but like you can often get yourself 10 minutes or 5 minutes, like before we go to a break, let's do this, and just buy yourself a little more time. Being brilliant at that, I think, can take practice, but also like if you give yourself 10 minutes, everybody will get better at it. You know what I mean? Like it's the pressure of the 2 minutes that's really, really hard.
Absolutely. And usually the group, they enjoy these breakout sessions to just have a little bit more time to reflect. And even if you just send them off with the prompt, okay, what was your favorite question of all of those? Or how would you answer them? This will basically occupy them for 5 minutes.
Sure. Yeah. I think that's something that people underestimate as facilitators is how much you have to, like, we're very, very oriented towards the group, but I think sometimes you have to carve out space for yourself and you have to actually make decisions based on what you need in order to serve the group. Like when I did a workshop on emergent facilitation, which is what I think of as like kind of building as you go. And I was like, the only thing that allows me to do that is giving myself breaks to figure out what the next step is. And a break doesn't have to look like time off. A break can just be small group work. It can be solo reflection time. It can be whatever. But I think that is often novel to newer facilitators, at least, is the idea that like you sometimes make decisions not because the group necessarily needs it, but you need it in order to serve them or to be present for them.
I love that. And thank you for pointing that out. It reminds me of the concept that you need to host yourself first before you can host a group.
Sure. Yeah.
And yeah, because if you are not in a position where you can really think on your feet and plan the next move, then this nervousness or clutter will spill over to the group.
Absolutely.
And from what you shared earlier, 2 things came to my mind that I would be very curious to explore. One is when you shared that in the beginning of your facilitation work, you were so enthusiastic about the topic of gender and sexuality. And that's why you developed basically intrinsically the best methods to engage the group and make them as enthusiastic about the content as you were. And I wonder where this could become a trap for a facilitator if can we be too engaged and too much in love with the content, because this might, air quotes, manipulate the group. And how would you deal with that?
Well, I think that, there's a lot there. I would say that I don't know about enthusiasm, but I would say that a lot of people, and I would say these people in my mind, like aren't necessarily going to identify as facilitators, are entirely enthusiastic about the content and not about the group. And to me, that's what often distinguishes or what I see as like a transition point for people who are like, yeah, I'm a presenter, I'm an educator, like I do around this content versus like I'm a facilitator and my content often is around these themes, or the work that I do is around these themes. So I think that there's a lot of people who are incredibly passionate about their content. They're really wanting people to leave with particular sets of information. And those people, I think, some can implement facilitation methods, but are often not approaching the experience as a facilitator. To me, as a facilitator, even in college, I believed that my first responsibility was to the group and the second responsibility was to the content. That like, if I promised that this space was a safe space for you to ask questions, which in social justice world, the word safe space is like kind of a controversial one. But just like if I told you, this is a place for you to ask questions, this is a place for you to get to be ignorant and have that met with like, yes, great. I'm so glad we get to get into this. If I tell you that, and then I don't actually create a space where that's true, I roll my eyes at you, I allow other people to without being like, hey, no, that's a legitimate question, let's get into that. Then I think that I'm shirking my responsibility to you. I'm like, and instead I might be prioritizing my excitement or responsibility or beliefs around the content, right? There are lots of times where I had to choose, like, I could just go straight into why you're wrong, but instead I actually need to like figure out how to connect to you, align with you, like get you and me on the same page before we can get into any of the content or the like material truth of your comment or your question, And so, I think a lot of people it's not like over enthusiastic about the content, but it's more like who and what are you prioritizing in the moment? And is what you're doing and what you're saying you're going to do the same thing, right? Mm-hmm. Like if you said, this is going to be a space for learning and exploration and growth, and what you're actually doing is like just throwing information at people, like, well, that's fine, but those maybe feel like different promises, right? And like if this space is like, we're going to do a lot of things together and we're going to get into deep conversations, we're going to unpack a lot of things. And then what happens is you end up giving people like 2 hours worth of content. That's going to feel really misaligned. And like, to me, I think of facilitation, or I think it might be useful sometimes to think of facilitation as like a medium, like a TED Talk is a medium, right? A book, a poem, a workshop, a facilitation, like those to me are all different types of mediums. And like, there's a message that there are things that books can do so brilliantly that a workshop cannot, right? And there's things that like a video, like, lecture or a piece of art can do so brilliantly that like a workshop cannot. And I think there are things that workshops can do that none of those other mediums can do. And so I think that sometimes the disappointment or the like misalignment is that we're not using the workshop in the right we're not using the medium for what it's best at. And I think that we've probably all gone to sessions where you're like, oh, this person is an expert. I am so excited to like sit back and learn from them and just receive the wisdom. And they're like, turn to the person next to you. And you're like, no, just tell me the things. Like, I don't want you to facilitate me. You are the experts in the field. You are so knowledgeable. I am here for your wisdom. Like, give me that wisdom. Like I've gone to sessions like that in conferences, right? Where I'm like, you 4 people at the front of the room have 80 years of experience in this. Like, please don't facilitate me and this rando, trying to figure out how to do this. That's not helpful unless it's going to help me get the information I came from, right? Like, so there are places for lectures. There are places for like, you don't want to call your plumber and have them be like, well, where do you think the water turn off is? No, like that would be terrible. But when it comes to having a discussion, when it comes to unpacking truth that's already in the room, when it comes to unpacking, like, what do you really think about this and what's going unsaid? And how does your socialization or your background, influence how you unconsciously think about things? Like, those are the best times. Like, to me, those are things that facilitation as like a medium or a art or a methodology or whatever, like that's what it's there for. That's what it's best at, is uncovering things that the group couldn't do without that container and allowing like things to emerge that like where the group is greater than the sum of its parts. To me, like that's the times where I'm just kicking it as a facilitator. Like, that is when I'm killing it, is because something happens that I couldn't have done by myself and they couldn't have done by themselves. It generated from beyond, right, as the collective. And to me, when we get too enamored with our content, it's because we're going into a different place, like we're maybe prioritizing a different type of medium and then calling it a workshop. And that's where the like delta of disappointment is, where you show up for a workshop and what you got was a lecture, or you show up for a lecture and what you got was a workshop, like those are really important differences.
And what you get is an email.
Right, exactly.
I love that. And love the example with the plumber.
Yeah, I've used that example a lot, so it's a go-to.
Hi, this is Andrew. I'm a facilitator and head of customer success at Session Lab, the dynamic workshop planner tool. More than 30,000 facilitators, trainers, and coaches use our workshop planner tool and save time and effort in the design process. So, how do they do it? Our drag and drop agenda builder makes it easy to transform your ideas into high-quality workshops, and the timing of your agenda automatically updates when you make changes. You can collaborate in real time with your colleagues and easily share professional-looking printouts with your clients. And if you need inspiration, you can check out our library of more than 500 activities and exercises and simply drag the ones you need right into your workshop agenda. So check out Session Lab to save time and effort in your workshop design process. And now get your first 2 months of Session Lab Pro absolutely free at sessionlab.com/workshopswork.
And what I hear also from what you shared before, that there are different ways we can learn about facilitation. There is from doing, as you said, there are some things we just need to experience, experiment, do it over again, fail forward. Then there is, as you also shared, participating and then observing other facilitators and taking notes on these meta level. So how did they just do that? How is it that the group is now full on and ask all these questions, whereas another time nobody engaged? And then there's a medium of a book, and you wrote a book yourself about facilitation. So what do you think is it about facilitation that we can learn from books? So when is a book a right medium to learn about facilitation? When is it experiencing someone else facilitating, so being a participant? And when is it to just go out there and give it a try?
Oh, that's such a good question. I don't know if I'll say before I give an answer, is that this answer will be very extemporaneous, because I don't think that I have tried to categorize what you've just asked before. And yeah, I did co-write a book about facilitation. It's called Unlocking the Magic of Facilitation.
Which is awesome.
And yeah, and that book came out of, so you'll find this background a little bit interesting, and then we can go into your question. So that book came out of running workshops with my co-facilitator at the time, Sam Killerman, and my co-author. He and I ran a lot of train the trainers, and we would have essentially 2 days to teach people how to run a 3-hour gender and sexuality workshop, that after those 2 days, we were going to leave and they were going to do it. They were going to do it for their community or their company or their often college. And we would have 2 days with them. And so the second day, we would get into kind of like concepts around facilitation. We would start really looking at the meta level and getting into those questions. And we always had so much more we wanted to give them, but we could never actually fit it into those 2 days. And so the book became the place where it was like, oh, we wanted to get into this topic, but we didn't. So here's the book. We didn't get into neutrality, or we didn't get into vulnerability, or we didn't get into how to ask good questions. And so all of those are in the book, and you can find that. And in a training, we would have gotten into about half of it. So I would say that all of those concepts, the concepts that are in the book, there are 11 of them, and I won't recite them. I don't think I could off the top of my head, but the concepts that are in the book, I think, are all things that probably people have some baseline experience, like they have some entry place into, right? There's some level of familiarity or just like, oh yeah, I've experienced when somebody shared something vulnerable and it felt okay. And I've also experienced it where somebody has shared something vulnerable and it felt bad, like where, the facilitator leading the meeting broke down and we all felt like, oh my gosh, we have to rush over and attend to their emotions. But I've had another one where a facilitator in a meeting was emotional, or in a training was emotional, and it actually felt okay. I don't know what the difference was, and I could be like, well, in the chapter, you might get into the difference, right? And so I think that a lot of the concepts in there are things that people have some familiarity with: vulnerability, questions, being triggered or activated in a workshop. But you might not have broken down in detail. You might not have figured out what's the important difference between this is good vulnerability and this is too much, or this is a good question and these are ones that are going to actually probably end up backfiring. So I think you want some level of familiarity with it. And it's probably also something that I think books are really good when you have some sort of disagreement with the concept. Yeah, if you have some sort of disagreement with me, then you can read 15 pages about why I think the way I think, right? Versus if I'm just going to tell you in a workshop, or I'm going to ask you to try something. If you have really strong disagreements with that, then we just might not be able to get into unpacking all of the different ways in which you disagree. So that's one thought I have, is some level of experience or familiarity with it. But I think that there are also concepts, right? At the end of it, I don't promise that you're going to feel confident doing things. I'm very much the person, can't remember who it came from, but there's some quote that really impacted me around confidence is what happens when you get things right again and again and again. Before then you need courage. Stop waiting for the confidence. You need courage at the beginning. Confidence comes from when people are like, you're brilliant at this. And they keep saying that. And you're like, okay, I feel confident. But before that, you just need courage. And so I think when it comes to, if you're nervous about, I'm nervous about, leading a Q&A with people asking questions I've never gotten before. I could be like, well, here's a bunch of structures and ways to run a really good Q&A to set yourself up for success. I could send that to you in a blog or an article or a book. But for you to be like, I feel good going in, I feel prepared going in, that's great. You can maybe prepare somebody, but they're going to have to do it in order for them to like embody that learning. So I think you can help someone prepare and prep and feel more ready going in, but I don't think you can ever make someone feel ready without trying it. Like that's when when the rubber hits the road, that's when they're going to be able to enter a new place of embodied understanding or internalized understanding.
Also, I guess to find their own words to be this authentic person, inviting the participants to join them in an experience, because I think it's like with teaching. My supervisor always said that he only teaches a course 3 times because after the 3rd time, he doesn't learn anything anymore. So every time we're teaching, we're rephrasing a concept. We embody or we learn it better for ourselves. And I think to read about a concept in a textbook and then to do it will feel kind of odd the first time you try it because it's not yours yet.
Yeah. Yeah. I also think that like facilitation is so abstract to most people who aren't facilitation geeks or who don't think of facilitation in the ways that we might, that they don't really know. Like somebody asked me recently, like, do you have any resources on facilitation? And I was like, yes, but what do you want to learn? And they were like, just anything. And I was like, okay. Well, I don't know if I have the resource for that person who's like, I want to learn anything about facilitation, because it might be like, well, which of these 15 concepts makes you feel anxious or curious or interested, right? Like, do you want to get better at asking questions? Do you want to get better at the first 5 minutes? Do you want to get better at like feeling empowered to cut people off? Like, what is, I think that new facilitators, they don't know what questions to ask in order to get better. And I feel like a lot of that sort of stuff you can deliver asynchronously via like text, right? You can do on a blog or a podcast. A podcast would be different, but you could get into that conversation. But that sort of stuff, I think you can start in that kind of asynchronous medium of a book. It's just like, here's some things you might not even realize you need to consider or that would be useful or empowering to consider. But then when it comes to the more detailed questions or the like, how do I do that, but stay authentic to me? I think that's probably the stuff that would be much more, vital and robust in person.
Do you believe in facilitation certification?
So to me, certification, like I'll clarify that first. To me, certification means like a standard that standard is published somewhere. That standard is kept up. As in, like, if your certification expires, you have to go back and get another one. You don't just get it one time and you're good to go forever. Like when I think of the certifications I've gotten in my life around like first aid responsiveness or like wilderness medicine, like that was something that expired after a number of years because we didn't expect you to keep that knowledge in your head forever, right? And there are people whose jobs, they have to go to CPR training every 2 years for the rest of their life, and those to me are like certifications that I feel really good about calling a certification. I think that a lot of people call a course a certification because they want to increase its apparent value. Like they're like, oh, we certify, I ran a thing for a long time where people asked us, do you certify Safe Zone facilitators? Safe Zone is the gender and sexuality training that I did. And I was like, no, because we're not going to make you come back. We're not going to make you come back. We're not going to upkeep. We're not going to evaluate you. There's no final test. There's no way for me to know any of those things, like other than you went through the course. And so we offered what we called a certificate of completion, which was basically like, you made it to the end. That's it. That's all we know you did, because that's all we know you did. And if someone's building out a facilitation certification, like I would say, if they were like, this is how I evaluate people, this is how I know, their skill sets or abilities, this is what I'm certifying them as, this is how often they have to re-up, like all of those things, I don't know if I would personally be like, ugh, don't do it. I think that's just like a skeezy business model. Like, I don't think that, but I do think calling things certifications that have none of those qualities, I don't agree with that. I'm not here for that. I am here for people wanting to like professionally skill up and wanting to get better at their craft and having a place to do that and having a way to demonstrate. And if they are able to demonstrate that to people and they want to be able to do that with a word, like that could be cool. What's interesting though, is I think most of the people who would be looking at that certification would have no context for it. Like most of the clients who would be seeing that on your resume would have no idea what that was. Professional facilitators aren't usually hired by professional facilitators. They're hired by completely non-professional facilitators. So unlike where you see, oh, Meg has a, CPR first aid certification, I have a vague idea of what that means. The layperson isn't going to know what any of the certification means. And I think that makes it very different than a lot of other things.
It's a very good point. On the one hand, I always feel that all the facilitators, at the end of the day, we're doing the same stuff. Right? We're using the same method, the same tools, but the way we use them is totally different.
Sure.
Because everyone comes from a different background, everyone frames them slightly differently or puts them in a different order. And then what at the end are you, certifying?
Mm-hmm. I think it's a good question, or I think it's a question for people, but I also know like some people really like having specific trainings that they're going to, that they're, aspiring to, that they feel like are really leveling up their professional skills. And they want that to feel official, and I think the word certification does that. Yeah, it's utility, like with wilderness first responder certifications, that means the person hiring you knows you've received this training, right? And that's really useful for them to know, and it's really useful for you to be able to display. And that's my, reference point. But with facilitation, like I doubt the people who are hiring you, unless they're looking for a particular, they're like, I know you've got this background, I know you have this certification, and that's a way for me to filter the 500 people who applied to this program. Is like, I want to know that you went through this. Then, wow, that's great utility. But I just think that's uncommon.
I was just thinking, if you have a first aid certification, then basically you're delivering the promise that you would know what to do to save someone's life.
Or properly bandage their leg. Yeah. Yeah.
To some extent. And it's very difficult to promise certain outcomes or results when we're dealing with group dynamics.
Yeah. I'm curious, like for you, does this feel like a really important thing for the field of professional facilitators to like talk about or agree upon the certification thing?
I realized that there are different camps of facilitators, and some who really believe in having and developing an international standard, because now everyone can call themselves facilitator, and
sure.
there are all kinds of facilitators out there. And I think that or a bad workshop can really have collateral damage. So I remember when I started off as a facilitator, I started the podcast basically because the answer I would get from people is, what? Facilitator? Oh, workshops. Are people still do that?
Mm-hmm.
Because workshops had such a bad reputation, at least in the environment where I tried to pitch myself.
Mm-hmm.
So on the one hand, I understand that it might be beneficial for the profession in general to have some quality standards. On the other hand, so I don't have any certification whatsoever in the field of facilitation, and still would consider myself as a professional facilitator doing a good job. So I haven't made up my decision, but I think it's I'm curious about the different answers, and I was especially curious about yours.
Yeah, I think that it makes sense to want to have a bar, or to be able to regulate in some way, I guess, like who uses a term to do what. And I guess if you have a certification, then you say like, I am a blank, blank, blank type of facilitator, right? And it means something specifically. I definitely don't think we can stop people from using the word facilitator who aren't good facilitators, let alone people who just aren't facilitating. I don't know how many times I've been in a session where people are like, I'm your facilitator for today. And then they're lecturing. And I'm like, no, like I think that's different. So I have no illusion that I'm going to control that. And that for me, part of my job when I am hired as a facilitator is to make it very clear what I mean when I say that, right? Or what you're hiring me for, or what the expectations of like what a session with me looks like. I think that that's on me. And like, yeah, as somebody who worked in social justice for a long time, like there was nobody coming in clean to my workshops who weren't bringing baggage of past experiences around workshops or trainings or just material related to the topic. Everybody had that. And I think there's no certification that could have prevented that. There's just, like, there's nothing I could have prevented that. I just needed to know that I was working with that truth, that no one was coming in with a clean slate and just like, I'm here to experience what you are doing. None of us are probably ever going to be somebody's first meeting or first training. That's a pretty rare thing. So yeah, we have to work with what's already true.
Which is a nice concept because there's so much to learn from that, from the good experiences and the bad experiences that everyone brings into the space.
Yeah, I had a facilitator tell me one time that they started a lot of their trainings with, how can we make this experience miserable? Like, how can we just like guarantee this meeting sucks? And no one, yeah, it's so good. Like, I love opposite thinking. It's way more fun than like, how can we make sure this goes really well? Like, no one is amped to answer that question, but like, how do we destroy this meeting is a fun question or an energizing question to start with until we all start doing it. And then everyone's like, oh, this question again. Like, you can make anything tired, but everyone's got opinions on that because everyone's been to a meeting before, right? Like, you're not starting from a clean slate. Or even to a training, maybe not with these colleagues or like maybe not in this setting, but yeah, I think that we're never starting from square one. And so that's just something we have to know about. We have to know how to set people up for success with us.
How would you distinguish a good facilitator from a bad facilitator?
So when I was in college, there were some people who were like, I'm really interested in running safe zone trainings and doing these gender and sexuality workshops. And these were other queer people, I'm queer, other queer people who were like interested in taking this over. And there were one of two of them where I was like, you don't like people that much. Like, and you particularly don't like ignorant straight people when they're interacting, especially around gender and sexuality stuff. Like, you won't like most of the people in your workshop, and not just like you won't like, but it's going to take a lot of work for you to be able to like empathize, connect, to not just align with them, but to tolerate them. Like, you have a pretty low tolerance for them. And so I was like, I don't think you should do it. Like, I don't think you should do that. I think that, and it's not to say that you have to like your participants or that you have to like identify with them. You don't. And it's not to say you can't dislike them. That's fine. Like, there's a lot of people I've had in workshops where I'm not a fan, I don't want to spend another 2 hours together, but you have to, I think, have at least a baseline tolerance for your participants. And at best, like a reasonable level of like acceptance of like, people are going to show up in lots of different ways, and that is okay. I am here for that. I am like willing to not find or be thrown by that. Or if I'm thrown, I'm committed to coming back. Right. But like, I am willing to show up for everyone who is going to show up in this workshop. There is no one who I will roll my eyes at and just allow myself to just dismiss. To me, when I see facilitators do that, where they're like, I'm not here for half this group, I'm like, oh, like, to me, I want to see people be there for the group, right? And that's not to say like you can't be like, you know what, this participant's not showing up in a way that I can actually work with, and I'm just going to like let them go physically out of the room or the Zoom, or emotionally, I'm going to stop paying attention to them and stop like giving them my emotional energy. That's a smart facilitation move, right? That's a necessary thing to do sometimes, but I don't think you should I don't think that should happen right off the bat. So to me, like, bad facilitator, I'm bad at critiquing people, but like, I would say that's not a good role for you, right? In social justice movements, which is where I come from a lot of times, like, there are lots of different roles people can occupy, right? There are the people who are like, I'm going to shut down the bridge because no one's paying attention to this problem, right? There are the people who sit in trees and protest logging. And those people have a particular type of like, they might have a particular type of energy or passion or skill set or abilities, or just like, I don't know, intrinsic personality that makes them like, I don't mind standing in front of, or like, I am willing to stand in front of traffic. That's the type of like energy that I'm bringing to this movement. And I'm going to force people to sit down at the table with us. And then there are other people who I think have a predisposition towards like, hey, thanks so much for coming to this table. Super great to see you. Let's have a conversation about this, right? And those people, I think, have like a propensity or a possibility of around like this facilitation space. And I think a bad facilitator is somebody who doesn't want to be a facilitator. Like they want to be doing something else, right? They're like, I'm here to make sure you leave with exactly this content in your brain. I'd be like, okay, that might be exactly a perfect thing for you to be, but it's not a facilitator, right? And so I think it's when people are a bad facilitator, somebody who doesn't want to facilitate and who wants to do other things that may be equally important. But again, it's back to that medium place. Oh, it took me a minute to get there, but that's what I believe. A bad facilitator is somebody who doesn't want to facilitate. They don't want to do that. They don't want to be there for the group. And they're not really open to the possibility of what could happen. They're there with their own conclusion, ready to go. And they're like, this is exactly where we're going to go today. And I'm not really open to a lot of possibilities. I'd be like, yeah, you could be a brilliant, I don't know, something else like educator, host, storyteller. There's lots of things you could be brilliant at. I'm just not sure you would be a brilliant facilitator, or I would think of that as a brilliant facilitator.
I wonder, from what you said, what is the level of self-awareness and what is pure character? Because I can imagine that also the example you gave, someone stepping into the room and say, I want to be the facilitator, where you say, maybe not so much. So Is it then a lack of self-awareness? And is this something that we can train to become better at in order? Because I think where it often goes wrong is that we get triggered by the group or individuals in the group, and that they would say something that makes us emotional.
Absolutely.
And I think in order to then become a good facilitator is also to just be aware of our trigger points. Where do you draw the line?
So I think that triggers is something, you don't have to be immune to them to be a good facilitator. I do think you have to have a commitment to navigating them. This is something that I used to teach specifically, or I do teach specifically. But to me, when I'm a facilitator, I have a disproportionate responsibility to the group compared to the other people in the room, right? Like if you are a regular participant and you go off at me, and you just fly off the handle, that's one thing, right? Not ideal, but it's that's one thing. If I do that as a facilitator, I think that is exponentially worse, right? Than any participant doing that. So I see facilitators as having a disproportionate responsibility to the people in the room, even if they don't have necessarily a disproportionate, we usually have a little more control, right? We might give it over and be like, here you go, group, you are leading this, this is really your conversation. And I'm really not going to be the main participant in it. And I think that's beautiful. But we do, I think, have a disproportionate responsibility. And so I think we have to have a commitment to navigating our own triggers when we are in a group. Whether that means we can do it the first time they show up is a totally different thing, right? But if somebody was like, that's on my participant to not trigger me, that's where I disagree. I'd be like, no, it's not on your participant to not trigger you. It would be ideal, right? It would be great if people didn't say things that triggered you or did things that triggered you. That would be awesome. But that's not actually their responsibility, because you are stepping into this unique space and unique leadership role of I am here for the group. We, I think, have a unique responsibility to navigate our triggers. And so if somebody was like, I'm not going to do that, I'd be like, I think I disagree. I think you need to. I think you have to have a commitment to identifying your triggers, getting better at them, learning new strategies for them. And it's okay if we all need permission to fail sometimes, or just to know that if we did fail, that's normal, right? I would not be standing here if I couldn't have done bad workshops, because you can't get better, right? Everyone wants a therapist with 20 years experience, but you have to have the first 20 years to get there, so you want a facilitator who's really good at their job, but you have to be bad at your job sometimes to get there. But I would say the self-awareness piece it can be taught. You can teach somebody how to pay attention to themselves when they're triggered. You can give your participants an opportunity to give you the feedback of like, this really wasn't okay. Or your co-facilitator, this really wasn't, like, what happened there? Like, that was you being triggered. That wasn't you showing up for the group. So it doesn't have to rest all on you. You can invite that outside perspective. But I think that's really important. And I would say, I think that's an essential part of being a facilitator, is that like, if you're taking responsibility for the group, then you have to kind of own that level of responsibility. The other piece, though, that you asked around like personality versus training, like, I want to be very clear that I think there's lots of different personality types that are good facilitators. There are those people who are like quiet and you kind of have to lean in to hear them. And when they say something, everyone pays attention because they're like, oh, that person's talking. I am not that person. Like, I am loud. I am, I will shout. I'll do like little games to get back your attention. Like, that's not going to be my energy. And I love those people. I think those people are really fantastic, right? And I think we do ourselves a huge disservice when we think all facilitators needs to be outgoing, extroverted, bombastic, charismatic people. Like, I have seen an incredibly uncharismatic person lead some really powerful stuff. And it was just because the forms they were using, the structures of their activities, the invitations and the way they set it up was fantastic. They were not charismatic, like almost to a point of it being like distracting, like where you were like, how do you do that being just such a not people person? But yeah, so I think you can be a facilitator with a ton of different personalities. But I do think that some people have a propensity that is helpful. They tend to be curious, or they tend to be introspective about the group, or they really care about what motivates different types of people, or they're interested in those things. I think all of those kind of propensities really help. And then to me, it's also just about like fit and want. Do you want to be able to do what a facilitation will allow you to do or unlock? Or are you resentful of being forced into that role? I think it's harder to get good at things we resent having to do, because there's no like intrinsic motivation to get better at them. So the people in my life who have been kind of forced into educator roles, and then I'm like, you're not very good at this. And they're like, I don't want to be good at this. And I'm like, well, that's a good reason to be bad at it. Like, you don't have your own self-motivation. So I think oftentimes when I see people who aren't good facilitators, it's because they don't want to be, or they're just not having the structures and the support system to like help them get better. And then you could tip into the like egotistical places where people are like, I'm brilliant. And we're like, you're not. And that's maybe a whole other category, right? If people were like, I'm a great facilitator. I know I'm a great facilitator, and I don't do feedback forms anymore because like, I know I'm brilliant. That's like another camp altogether, but I don't run into that as much.
Thank you. Thank you for staying tuned and listening to the show. I appreciate your attention, as I know how busy you are. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and engage by sharing your comments and thoughts, and visit workshops.work to download the one-page summary. I'm looking forward to seeing you back at the next episode, and I wish you a fruitful day.